annual Ariel Avrech Yahrzeit Memorial Lecture. Special thanks to Rabbi Muskin for all he's done for us. Ariel, I love the shul deeply, and it's only appropriate that we hold these memorial lectures here. Every one of you is a close friend in one way or another, and we appreciate you coming, and we appreciate all your support. Thank you so much. Happy Father's Day. Rabbi Perl is an eminent historian, receiving the highest academic honors from Harvard University, while also receiving smicha from Yeshiva University. As a teaching fellow at Harvard, Rabbi Perl was twice awarded Harvard's prestigious Certificate of Distinction in Teaching, and in the spring of 2006, he was named Yeshiva University's Lillian F. and William L. Silber Professor of the Year. Rabbi Perl has lectured throughout the country on topics related to the history of modern Jewry, as well as intellectual changes facing contemporary Orthodoxy. Currently, Rabbi Dr. Perl is Dean of Margolin Hebrew Academy in Memphis, a really wonderful up-and-coming Jewish community. The title of Rabbi Perl's lecture is What Was the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the Yeshiva, Reading? Intellectual Openness in 19th Century. When Rabbi Perl asked Karen and I to select a title from the list of possibilities, today's subject jumped out at us particularly appropriate, since it so relates to issues that Ariel confronted daily in his own life. In fact, reading fine literature was so important to Ariel that we established Seraphic Press as a legacy to his memory. Seraphic Press's goal is to publish quality young adult Jewish literature. You see, Ariel always loved books. In fact, he loved words. One of his pet peeves was the misuse and the twisting of language, sometimes in the form of redundancies where people would say pita, bread, instead of just pita. He loved to write, even enjoying the physical act of using a fine fountain pen. He enjoyed literary details from the complex drawings of Richard Sperry books of his childhood to the Labyrinthian Gemara. He had endless patience. As we said last year, Ariel's greatest joy was rewarding himself with a cold, tall glass of water after solving a particularly difficult page of Talmud. Ariel loved the sardonic humor of Adelbert and Calvin and Hobbes, and was meticulous in collecting the complete works of each author. When Harry Potter entered the scene, he devoured the tomes in a day or two. He never went anywhere without a book in his hand. Waiting just never bothered him. He would devour whatever book was with him. But as Ariel grew spiritually, he was torn. He felt he needed more guidance in reconciling secular philosophy and science with religious ideologies. He found wonderful answers in the books of Rabbi Akiva Tatz, and another book that had a great impression on him was Fingerprints on the Universe by Louis Pollock. Ariel restricted secular books to weekdays and involved himself deeply with Sevarim on Shabbos. Seraphic Press was established as a way to ensure that there were more books of quality literature that would be accepted in the yeshiva world. The first book, The Hebrew Kid and the Apache Maiden, got Ariel's stamp of approval while he was lying in the hospital reading my first draft. Ariel certainly would have been curious to know what the Rosh Yeshiva was reading. We know Rabbi Perl will provide us with unique perspective and information that would certainly have helped Ariel in his life's quest. Thank you.
So let me begin then by thanking Robert, Karen, for inviting me to participate in what has been a wonderful Shabbos and a most meaningful tribute to someone who seems like a most special person, one whom I wish I could have met. I was told a story that several years ago, a young man was recommended a book by his father. The young man, who had newly been turned on to the world of the yeshiva and yeshiva learning, asked his father who wrote the book, and when told that the author was a renegade Jew, one who grew up in an Orthodox home, yet had cast away his upbringing and sought greener pastures, the boy said, "Sorry, Dad, the book's not for me. I don't think it's appropriate for me to be reading such things in the circles within which I now travel." But a few weeks later, the parents of this young man came to visit him in yeshiva. And they were invited to the Rosh Yeshiva's home for tea. And as they're sitting there together with their son nudges the father and points to a book on the shelf. The very book that the father had recommended was sitting there on the Rosh Yeshiva's bookshelf. The young man was none other than Ariel Avrech. The journey that Ariel went on in seeking this balance, trying to understand what is appropriate for one in the yeshiva world to read and one is not, really mimics a journey that I myself took several years ago, also as a young man studying in yeshiva. And that's really what I wanted to share with all of you this morning, is give you a glimpse into this journey that I myself took and to the discoveries that came my way as a result. My journey began as a young man learning in yeshiva. I was introduced to a particular commentary on the Torah, a commentary known as Ha'amek Davar, a commentary of Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, a running commentary of all 5 books of Moses, the 5 books of the Torah. And I was drawn to it, and looking back, probably drawn to it because of its creativity, because of the uniqueness and the unabashedness with which the Nitziv would offer commentaries that nobody else ever said before, and really do it in a way that was rather unique, rather creative, and really drew me in. And as I continued on my own academic career, first as an undergraduate and then as a graduate student, I was introduced to the world of what we'd call intellectual history. A world where we're taught to ask critical questions about texts, about ideas. And so my mind began to ask questions about this text which I had grown to love. And each time I would reopen it and look at some of the comments therein, I would find myself asking the same questions over and over again. Where did he get this from? How did he know this? What was he reading? Let me fill you in. Let me give you a little bit more of the picture here. Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin was born in 1816 in a small Lithuanian town of Mir. Now, Lithuania refers to the geographic region. For the entirety of the 19th century, Lithuania was part and parcel of Tsarist Russia. At the age of 13, a marriage was arranged for the little Naftali with the daughter of the Rosh Yeshiva of Lillian, which was then just ascending as the greatest yeshiva, the greatest place of traditional Torah learning anywhere in the world. And so at the age of 14, little Naftali is sent off to Volozhin, a tiny hamlet in the middle of nowhere in the Lithuanian countryside. And there he remained until 1892, when at the age of 75 he went off to seek medical treatment in the city of Warsaw, where ultimately he passed away. So in other words, for the entirety of his life, from 1830 until 1892, for 62 years, Nitziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, sat and learned and studied and taught in this tiny little hamlet of Volozhin. Never got a secular education, never traveled to the West, never was exposed to any great learning other than the traditional canon of the yeshiva, which was Talmud, and nothing else. And so again, the question's in my mind, where did he get some of this stuff from? It doesn't come from the Talmud. Let me give you some examples. If you open the packet which you have in front of you, I've given you but 5 examples of places from his commentary which spurred me to such questions. But before we begin here, the most obvious place, the most obvious element of this commentary which should spurn such questions is the very fact that everybody agrees that the Nitziv in this commentary proves himself a master of Hebrew grammar, an absolute master. And we also know that the yeshiva, and certainly the yeshiva in Volozhin, didn't teach Hebrew grammar. And certainly Hebrew was not the language that people spoke. They spoke Yiddish. And Yiddish is a far cry from Hebrew. So that in and of itself asks the question, well, where did he get that from? How did he learn Hebrew grammar? Not just learn it, but come to master it in a way that was paralleled by few. But beyond that, let's look at some of these comments. The first one that you have on your page, Vayimachas Kol HaYikum, comes from the story of Noach and the flood. And there he writes, Namchu HaGufos v'dayak HaKasuv asher al pnei ha'adama davka elu shayu munachim al pnei ha'adama. Aval nishtayru kama gufos shenafal aleihem afar harbei al yidei shetef hamayim v'nisharu ha'gufos kayamim v'hein hinei atzamos shemotzin chofrei ha'aretz umotziin atzamos mibrios shelo nimtza atzah ba'olam. Says the Nitziv, says the Torah specifically says that the animals, the bodies that were wiped out by the flood were only those that were above the surface of the ground. But he says there were certain animals from before the flood that had already been concealed by the ground itself, and those weren't destroyed by the flood. And that's why, says the Nitziv, certain diggers of the earth are turning up fossils of animals that we've never seen before. Fascinating. Doesn't talk about that in the Talmud. How did he know what they were turning up and digging out of the earth? The next one. The next one refers to a practice, which he says was common amongst the ancient Near Eastern world, of women going out and becoming spectators at the battlefield. They would dress themselves up, put all sorts of jewelry on themselves, and would come out to watch men fight. Fascinating. But how did he know that? Next, he refers to the Minhag Yeshiva, Mot Hayel Yishtadel Adas Ofen Gishmei Hashana. The way in which the 7 nations of the land of Canaan would try various ways to try and predict when the rain cycles would come. A similar question. In the next one, he refers to the practices of the ancient Near East in which the Yishmaelim would grow certain parts of their beards. And he says, if you look at the bottom, he says that such is still, Kimosha od hayom minhag bnei Yishmael kach. That such is still the practice of these Arab nations to this day. Again, where did he get that information from? Sitting in a yeshiva in the hamlet of Volozhin. And lastly, he refers to practices, again of the ancient Near East, mourning practices, where people would cut themselves and they would cry out. And once again, he refers to the fact that such are still the practices of these Arab nations right down to this very day. So again, the question ringing in my head over and over again, what was he reading? How did he get this information? It simply didn't come, it doesn't come, out of a simple reading of the Talmudic text. And of course, the part that bothered me most was that I would read over this commentary time and time again, and the commentary itself gives us no clue. It's silent. Never does he cite anything other than traditional texts and traditional commentaries on those texts. So for all intents and purposes, if you read this commentary on Torah, it simply came to him out of thin air. You simply don't know where he got any of this information from. Well, it seems that I wasn't the first to ask this particular question. About 10 years after the death of the Nitziv, his nephew, who also happened to be his brother-in-law, that's a story we'll leave for another time, sat down to write a memoir of his life in Lithuania, a memoir particularly centered around the life of his father, the famous Aruch HaShulchan, Yechiel Michal Epstein, and his uncle, the Nitziv. This work, written by the Torah Tamima, recounts several stories with regard to the Netziv himself and the world in which he lived. One of the stories that he tells goes as follows. He said that late in the Netziv's life, he was approached by a man by the name of Yehoshua Steinberg. Yehoshua Steinberg was known as one of the great maskilim of his generation. A maskil was an enlightened Jew, a Jew who by the second half of the 19th century had begun to delve into the world of secular learning, looked to change the traditional canon of Jewish learning, and Yehoshua Steinberg was amongst the best. And they say that Yehoshua Steinberg approached the Netziv with the following question. He says to him, Rabbi, I, Yehoshua Steinberg, know a bit about Hebrew grammar. But I acquired such knowledge after years and years of study. He said, you also seem to know Hebrew grammar, at least just as well as I do, if not better. And so said the Netziv, tell me, Rabbi, how is it so? You have spent your whole life sitting here in yeshiva, learning nothing but Talmud. I have spent years delving into works of Hebrew grammar. I know why I know it. How is it that you have mastered Hebrew grammar at least as well as I have? And says the Torah Tamima, he records the following answer that the Netziv allegedly gave to Yehoshua Steinberg. He said, I'll tell you a parable. A parable about two merchants who are traveling and find each other at an inn along the roadside somewhere in the Lithuanian countryside. And the two merchants begin to speak with one another. One is a fabulously wealthy and successful textile merchant. The other is a trader of shmatas and trinkets who never made much in his life. And the two begin exchanging stories. And the less successful merchant turns to the more successful merchant and said, may I see your wares? And the more successful merchant says, sure, and he brings them out to the wagon which is carrying the textiles which he had picked up from the most prestigious textile houses in St. Petersburg and was on his way to bring them back to Vilna. And this other merchant looks at them and marvels at the quality, and all of a sudden his eye is taken by the leather belts which have strapped the textiles together. And he turns to the merchant and he says, where did you get such high quality fine leather belts from? And the more successful merchant turns to him and says, well, I got them from the textile houses in St. Petersburg. And the other one turns back to him and he says, well, how much do they cost? And the more successful merchant turns back to him and he says, what do you mean, how much did they cost? They give them to me for free. So the lesser merchant, blessed with a wonderful Yiddish cup, figures out now his answer to his financial woes. He knows how he's now going to make a killing. He changes course of his planned route and he sets out for St. Petersburg to head to the great textile mills, knowing that he can pick up belts for free and bring them back to Vilna and sell them and make a killing. And so he shows up in St. Petersburg, he comes to the textile houses and he says, I would like 50 belts. And the manager of the house says, okay, a strange request, but I can in fact give you 50 belts if you so choose. It'll be 50 ruble. And the merchant looks at him and he says, what do you mean 50 ruble? 50 ruble, 50 belts. I just met a merchant along the way. He said you gave him 50 belts for free. And so the manager of the textile mill says, I'm sorry, but he bought 200 ruble worth of textiles. So yes, indeed, we threw the belts in for free. But you have come asking only for belts, and you will have to pay. And so records the Torah Tamima in this work. The response of the Netziv to Yehoshua Steinberg was, you who sought to learn only Hebrew grammar, you had to pay 50 ruble. You had to spend years of studying in order to acquire it. But me, who sought out to learn Torah, to learn traditional Jewish texts. For me, God threw the grammar in along the way for free. Now, did the Netziv actually say such a thing? I don't know. Did such an encounter between Yehoshua Steinberg and the Netziv actually take place? I don't know that either. Here's what I do know. I do know, rather decisively, that that is not the way in which the Netziv acquired his knowledge of Hebrew grammar. And perhaps by the time we finish our lecture today, though, we'll at least be able to understand why such a story came about and how it got recorded in the annals of history. I know that, in fact, this is not the way the Netziv acquired his knowledge because, as I said before, I had set out on a journey to try and figure this out for myself. And the journey took me from work to work written by the Netziv until ultimately I came to what I dated as his earliest work, a commentary written on Sifrei. Sifrei being a compilation of old rabbinic teachings, exegesis, on which the Netziv wrote a commentary as a young man, but didn't publish it in his lifetime. It was only published about half a century after his death by his descendants. And I remember clearly those days that I was first coming to this particular commentary and turning its pages and literally felt the excitement of an archaeologist pulling something out of the ground, knowing that I had found it. I had found the answer I was looking for. Because here in this old commentary lied the answers to what the Rosh Yeshiva was reading. Because unlike his later Torah commentary, which he did publish, this unpublished commentary had all sorts of references to all sorts of books that indeed the young Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin was reading. And let me share some of them with you. If you turn the page, you find a photocopy of one page of this particular text. Up here is the text of the Sifrei itself. Again, that rabbinic manuscript, that rabbinic compilation of rabbinic exegesis. And on the bottom, you find the commentary of the Netziv himself. And if we start on the right-hand side, the bottom of that column, where it's first underlined, you see that the Netziv calls the reader's attention to Kuzari, Ma'amar Bet, Ot Kaf Bet, Perush Acher al Zeh, the Ayin Sham Be'otzar Nechmad. Okay. He refers the reader to Kuzari, which is a famous Jewish philosophical work of medieval times, and refers to a commentary written on it called Otzar Nechmad. Now, if you flip the page one more time, actually twice, you're going to see that I have given you some brief biographies of certain individuals taken from the Encyclopedia Judaica, just so that you begin to get a sense for some of the people that we're talking about. And the first one that we're referring to is here on the second page of that particular list, a man by the name of Israel ben Moses Halevi Zamost. You see, again, the name Zamost, and you read the first line that it says there, who was this man? This man was a Talmudist, a mathematician, and one of the early Haskalah writers. And later on in his biography, you'll see that he wrote a work called Otzar Nechmad. Right? The work I've put into a little box. So this is a work, not terribly radical, but a work written by an early Haskalah writer, which the Netziv as a young man is citing. Go read this commentary. Go read what he had to say on this particular topic. Okay, let's continue a little bit further down on the very same page. The next underlined area, again, we're back to this page in the Sifrei, right, back to this page of his commentary. He writes, Ayin harchev dibur hadibur bazeh ha'inyan b'tshuvos radbaz chela gimel siman taf membet ubehakdamat sefer eshkol hakofer al dikduk. Let's stop there. He tells you, go look in this place in the Radbaz and also look at the introduction to the work called Eshkol HaKofer on Dikduk, on Hebrew grammar. Oh, a work of Hebrew grammar being learned by the young Netziv. Let's flip the page again and find out who this Eshkol HaKofer was. Kofar, by the way, here does not mean heretic. Okay, don't get too excited. All right, on the top of the next page, and you see Hadassi, Yehuda ben Eliyahu, or Judah ben Elijah, who was the author of Eshkol HaKofer, that the Netziv tells his writer to go read, a Karaite scholar of Constantinople. His greatest work is the Eshkol HaKofer, which according to his testimony began in 1148. A Karaite. Right? A Karaite, somebody who traditional Judaism, right, had seen as heretics. People who rejected the world of the oral Torah, the oral tradition. Right? And here is the young Netziv reading his works because they taught him grammar. And not only reading them, but telling his readers in his commentary to go ahead and read the works of Hadassi as well. Flip back. We're not finished yet. Again, we're down here in the underlined section of this particular commentary, and now things get interesting. That last line there, he writes, another place to look on this particular issue, Ubehaktamat Chumash Beso V'Taf Aleph. Chumash Beso V'Taf Aleph. What on earth does that mean? Well, generally, in rabbinic literature, if you see a chumash cited with the abbreviated Taf Aleph, it generally refers to what? Does anybody know? I heard it. No? Unklus, very good. Targum Unklus. Right? Taf Aleph usually refers to Targum Unklus. That is the traditional Aramaic translation of the Hebrew text, which in most traditional printings of the Chumash, right, is there along the inside margin. So if I would look at this text, I would think, right, he's referring to something called Chumash Beso, V'Taf Aleph, and Targum Unklus. But in fact, he's not. Look at that word Beso. What is that? Right? Bet Ayin Samech Vav. Well, as Beso, it is nothing. It refers to nothing certainly that I know of. However, look at that first letter, right? It's a bet. Right? A bet goes like this. Again, a bet goes like this. Now, take your bet again and draw that line a little further down. What does that look like? It could look like a kof, but again, it's one letter. A chaf sofit, or I heard it in the back. A dalid. Yes, indeed. Right? A bet extended down could well look like a dalid. Well, then let's try reading that again. If that bet were not a bet but a dalid, it would say ubehakdamas chumash desau. The Taf Aleph would stand for what, Gil? Not Targum Unklus, but anybody? Targum Ashkenaz. And the reference would be to the Chumash that was printed in the Prussian city of Dessau with a German translation. This was the Chumash and commentary and translation written by none other than Moses Mendelssohn. And here the Netziv is referring his readers to the works of Moses Mendelssohn, and indeed it is the case because I have looked it up. And the very topic that he's talking about here is what Mendelssohn is talking about there in his introduction to his work on Chumash. Was there a question?
Why wouldn't he refer to it from Mendelssohn? Why wouldn't he refer to it as Hebrew?
Why wouldn't he refer to it?
By its name.
Oh, I believe he did. I believe it's his ancestors 50 years later, when printing it, who printed it perhaps a little bit differently than he had written it. What leads me to believe such is that I went and I hunted down the manuscripts on this. The family currently lives in Geula, one of the most religious neighborhoods in Jerusalem today, and they were extremely hesitant about letting me anywhere near these manuscripts. And what happened was I would have to tell them, I had asked them if I could leaf through them, and they told me no way. What I had to do was they would ask me what I wanted to see, and they would open it up. There were two of them sitting at the table. They would look at it, and if it was okay, they would let me see it. So once I got the hang of what we were doing, I realized I couldn't ask them to see the reference to Mendelssohn. So I had to ask them to see something a little higher up that I thought would be on the same page. So I did. And when they gave me the text, this reference to Chumash Besa was underlined in pink. Okay.
But what were you looking at? You were looking at an original edition?
I'm sorry, I can't see who's asking the question.
Original edition of this work?
Yes, I was looking at the Nitziv's manuscript of his commentary on the Sifrei.
But it was cited the same way?
Yes.
With the same mistake of a bet rather than...
I couldn't see it clearly enough, right, to know whether it was actually elongated as a dalid in the manuscript itself. So to give them the benefit of the doubt, perhaps it was unclear in the text, which is why they underlined it, right, in pink. Right? But perhaps it was because they didn't want it to be published as it was. But the truth of the matter is that's just the beginning. Right? And throughout this text, and I've given you again in these next few pages a few more of the texts which the Nitziv cites along the way. Each one I've put into a box, so you see on this page again underneath Hadassi, you see the work of Elijah Levita. Again, a Hebrew philologist, grammarian, and lexicographer. His work, Mesoret HaMesoret, is also quoted and cited by the Nitziv in this work. This work was not without controversy itself, as it was Levita who first suggested that the vowels and the trup, that is the marks which tell us how to sing, traditionally sing the Torah text, were not in fact always part and parcel of our Masorah, but were rather added in at a later date, and that got him into some trouble. But again, a work which was not read by others, indeed read by the Nitziv himself. What I would like to focus on for the next few minutes, though, is the next author, an author by the name of Azariah de Rossi. Azariah de Rossi and his work, Ma'or Einayim, are quoted by the Nitziv on several occasions throughout this work, his commentary on the Sifrei. Now you can see from the biography, and I'm not going to read it all with you, Azariah de Rossi was a fascinating figure. An Italian scholar, a historian, one of the first critical thinkers that we had in the line of Jewish thinkers. He wrote this work, which is really a strange compilation of a bunch of different things. But it was this work, Ma'or Einayim, which got him into all sorts of trouble. Because in it, he does several things that anger the rabbinic establishment around him. Amongst them are the fact that he cites non-Jewish authors, particularly Christian fathers, and often refers to their account of history as more authentic and more genuine than perhaps the traditional account of Jewish history which had come down within Jewish circles. He provides a chronology of the Second Temple period which goes against the way in which Jews had traditionally imagined and envisioned that time period. And perhaps most strikingly, throughout this work, Ma'or Einayim, Azariah de Rossi time and again refers to the Aggadic literature of the rabbis. That is, the narrative stories which come down to us, the non-legal portions of rabbinic writing, as not necessarily intended to be taken literally. That their accounts of history weren't intended to be taken as accounts of history per se, but rather teaching stories that had a lesson and a moral. Their accounts of science weren't intended to be taken as pronouncements of the way in which the world worked, but perhaps reflected their best understanding of the world, an understanding which was sure to change with the changing of time. And indeed, these particular elements of this work got de Rossi into all sorts of trouble, right, by the rabbis of his time. He was placed into cherem, he was banished, his work was banished, right, by none other than Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, who seems to have written a pronouncement against Azariah de Rossi's work. And later on, the Maharal mi Prague, right, the great rabbi in the city of Prague, right, spends pages upon pages denouncing Azariah de Rossi, denouncing his work, and in particular, his approach to the rabbis and the Aggadic literature. Yet, when we turn to the work of the Netziv as a young man, time and again, he not only cites this work by Azariah de Rossi, but calls his readers' attention to it, says, go read it yourself, and not only that, the places he tells us to read are the absolute worst paragraphs in that entire book. Let me show you some. We're now on this page, right, following the biographies. We have returned, we have another page here from the Netziv's commentary. And on the left-hand side, you see the little line on the left. And here, the Netziv is talking about different types of rabbinic exegesis. Midrash. He's talking about precisely the types of issues that de Rossi took up and was criticized for in his work. And there at the bottom, you see a little parentheses, and by the way, the parentheses was added by the Netziv himself. Right? He writes in those parentheses, V'ayin, b'ma'or einayim, chelek daled, perek tet, ma'arich bazeh. Now, chelek daled, by the way, is not really chelek daled. That's also a printing mistake. Again, a daled and a bet that was probably confused. But nonetheless, right, if we look at what he's referring to, which is really section 2, right, Imre Bina, that is on the right-hand side, this English text is an English translation of de Rossi's work. Right? We can see what it is that the Netziv is calling our attention to. And here, de Rossi writes as follows. Similarly, in his explanation of the Agadot and Brachot in Bava Batra, cited by Abohav, Rashba of blessed memory speaks of the Midrash on the verse, therefore those who make parables would recite, come to Cheshbon. Okay, here we go. He writes, in Midrashim such as these, the point of our sages is to provide support from Scripture by using expressions which render them memorable, but they had no intention whatsoever of interpreting the verses as such. Moreover, with regard to the verse, gather to me 70 men, the sage Rekanani writes, you should realize that our rabbis sometimes make a true pronouncement based on tradition or clear-cut evidence, and then cite a verse as a mnemonical allusion to it, or simply as support. Here is de Rossi writing in black and white, that when the rabbis say things sometimes you don't have to take it as literal. They didn't intend it so. When they say they got something from a particular verse, they didn't necessarily get it from that verse. They had a tradition. And in order to remember the tradition, they took it and they linked it to this particular verse so we'd remember it better. But they never meant to suggest that that's actually how we were supposed to read the verses of the text. Let's flip the page. The same section of this work by de Rossi, look on the right-hand side where it says page 288 on the top. Again, de Rossi. From this we may gather that the Agadot are undoubtedly not to be regarded as authentic and received halacha, but merely conjecture on the part of their inventor. There is perhaps no more heretical way to refer to the writings of the rabbis than conjecture on the part of their inventor. Right? And yet this is the very section that the Netziv told us to go and look at. Flip the page. I'll show you another one. Here, the Midrash, famous Midrash, notes that the text of the Torah refers to the Israelites, the Jewish people in the desert, saying that they want to go up and conquer the land of Israel. And so says the Midrash, if in fact they had to go up, right, and to conquer the land of Israel, right, it must be Magira Katuv she'eretz Yisrael givoah mikol ha'aratzot. It must be that the land of Israel is higher than all other lands. And anybody with any sense of topography knows that it isn't true. Right? Certainly Israel is not topographically higher than the Himalayas. Right? Certainly not. So the Netziv, in his commentary on this particular verse, writes, how do we understand this? What seems to be against our knowledge of the natural world? Go look at Azariah Rossi again, if you want to know how to deal with this particular text. And there he gives two different answers provided by Rossi himself. He cites them. Here's how we deal with difficult rabbinic texts, ones that are hard to understand, like Rossi did. Don't take them literally, because they weren't intended to be so. I'll show you one more that's perhaps even more amazing. Flip the page. Here, the work of Sifrei refers to a place called Cartigny. And the Netziv in his commentary says, if you'd like to know what this place is that the Midrash is referring to, Kartaga, Hamefursemet Biosifon Shekivsha Ameshifia Gibur Romi. What is this? This is the city of Carthage that Josephus has made famous. V'ayin b'sefer me'or einayim la'adomi im Rebina Perik Yud Aleph v'timtza mekoma be'Africa. You want to know where it is? Well, go read Azariah Rossi, and he'll show you he's located this particular city in Africa. Well, being a good student of the Netziv, I did. I went into Rossi, and I read it. And if you look on the other side of the page, on the right-hand side, you'll see how Rossi knew where Carthage was. The underlined lines. Furthermore, the Christian translator Jerome, and he was also wise, translates Tarshish was your merchant in Ezekiel as Carthage, referring to Old Carthage, which was in Africa Minor in the time of Solomon and Ezekiel. How did the Netziv know? How did Rossi know where Carthage was? Because he read Jerome, Saint Jerome. And here's the Netziv in Volozhin telling his readers, go read Rossi, who cites Jerome, who will tell you where Carthage is in Africa. Amazing. Right? Two of the three issues which the rabbis had such an issue with regard to Rossi, his criticism of the rabbis and their approach to Aggadic literature, as well as his use of Christian sources. Those are the very two issues which the Netziv calls his readers' attention to in the writings of Rossi. Now, lest you think that the controversy over Rossi has died down in the 150 years which have passed since the Netziv wrote this, I have given you a little text here, the next page on the right-hand side. A text written not too long ago. You can see from the date on the top. It's a text of banishment for a work by a man by the name of Slifkin. Some of you might be familiar with the works of Slifkin. Natan Slifkin wrote a series of works. He is an incredibly bright young man who knows biology incredibly well, and has written a series of works which explain the biology behind the Torah, explain to some degree evolution in terms that an Orthodox Jew, that is compatible with the worldview of an Orthodox Jew. And his writings in some circles of the Orthodox world, though, were seen as heretical, and a banishment was pronounced, and people were told not to read this particular work. But let us read what the text of this banishment says. Karu lefanai kama kita'im b'targum miluli misvarim shel Slifkin v'advarim mizazim kol halev hacharei l'dvar Hashem. Somebody read before me a few paragraphs from the work of Slifkin, and what he wrote makes the heart tremble, right, of those who tremble before God. Divrei kfira gmura ba'amita shel Torah. It is heresy at its greatest. Ve'achashat magideha. Ve'adavar nora ki klapei chutz nirim advarim ki'ilu chalila hetiru perushim es adavar v'nasnu makom lahatir ledvarim elu lavo bekahal chalila. Those who don't know will think that we gave our approval to these things. Right? And we'll think that we allowed such things to come into our community. Bevadai shedvar zeh naaseh b'shgagag mura, v'makom sheyesh chilul Hashem hu, v'sfarim elu sifrei minim heim. Right? Certainly this was not done intentionally, but nonetheless, these works are the works of heretics. Ukemo shekasuv, now follow me, Rabbeinu Maharal al Sefer Me'or Einayim Sheyatza B'daro Ayin B'dvarav Be'ura Shishi B'Sefer Be'ura Gola. What is this like? Says this particular rabbinic author of our time, says this work of Slifkin is just like the work Me'or Einayim, right, which was banished in its day by none other than the Maharal. And he quotes what the Maharal had to say about the work Me'or Einayim. Here we go. Arur yihyeh hayom asher bo niglu v'nir'im dvarim elu. Says the Maharal about the Me'or Einayim, which is also what Rav Moshe Shapiro is saying about the work of Slifkin. Cursed be the day that such things were brought, right, that such things were brought to our vision. Ish asher lo yada lahavin divrei chachamim, af davar achad midivrei maktanim, v'chulei, ech lo yarei lidaber b'chachamim, v'yidaber alehem ki'ilu heim anashim b'daro, chavirav. He says, how can a person who doesn't understand a thing about Torah, a thing about our sages, talk about our sages in such a way as if they were his own friends, criticizing them as if they were his own colleagues? V'yoter mizeh, ki natnu dvarav asher heim ru'uyim lehisaref kemo sifrei minim, v'heim yoter gruim mehem v'nasnu b'tfus ki'ilu hayu sifrei kodesh. And worse still, says the Maharal, who was still living in the early days of print, not only has he said such things, but he's put them into writing, into a book that pretends to be a holy book, right? A book of learning. Right? These are books, says the Maharal, that deserve to be burned. So, to this very day, right, the work of Me'or Einayim, of Azariah de Rossi, is one that conjures up images of the worst type of heresy, right, within certain circles of the Orthodox world. And again, this is a work who at its most, perhaps heretical places, is cited by the Rosh Yeshiva, by the man who was to be the head of the largest yeshiva in the world in his time, the Yeshiva of Lillian, the man known as Netziv. Well, so I began to get an answer. I began to realize what it was that the young Netziv was learning, but as I began to dig further, I began to see that there was more. Because the Netziv was not alone. Because once I had answered this question, what was the Rosh Yeshiva reading, I had to ask myself, well, how? How is it possible? What brought him to such works? How did he have the chutzpah to read and to cite Azariah de Rossi, amongst other things, when this was a work that the Maharal had put into Cherem, and that the Mechaber that Rav Yosef Karo had put into Cherem and excommunicated? How could he do it? And so I began to read other works from the same time, and saw that he wasn't alone. The work you have on the left-hand side of the same sheet, you have the names on the cover, was written by a man by the name of Rabbi Yehuda Leib Edel. He was the Maggid of the Lithuanian town of Slonim. The Maggid, it was not a storyteller as we often imagine them to be. The Maggid was a public position, a communal position, right, of the preacher. He was the official preacher of the town of Slonim. And in his famous work, Afike Yehuda, he too cites the work of Me'or Einayim. Flip the page. On this page, you have the writings of Rabbi Avraham ben Hagra, Abraham, the son of the Vilna Gaon, also one of the most well-respected rabbis in the city of Vilna in his time. And you can see he himself writes, Ubaal Me'or Einayim Asaf Malei Ro'im Mulim ve'arilim. Not only refers to the Me'or Einayim, but refers to the fact that the Me'or Einayim is a great place to find a collection of Jewish and non-Jewish sources, right, collected together. But it doesn't stop with de Rossi. What I found was that there was an entire world here in the early 19th century that was reading all sorts of texts that were not part of the traditional Jewish canon. I call your attention on the next page to the commentary of the Radal. Rabbi David Luria considered amongst one of the greatest rabbis of his time, the rabbi of a city called Old Bichov, also in Lithuania. And you see his commentary here on the left-hand side. This is a traditional page of the Midrash Rabbah. Here on the left-hand side is the commentary of Radal. And look at what he says. He says, Zeh hayam sheb'ma'arav Eretz Yisrael hanikra b'Torah hayam hagadol, u'b'shonenu hayam hatichon, v'chol ha'mekamot she'izkiru kan al hayam hazeh. We're referring to here in the Midrash, the Mediterranean Sea, he says. V'hinei ra'iti shekatvu chachamei hateva davar nifla. Here says the rabbi of Old Bichov in Lithuania in the beginning of the 19th century, I saw something amazing that the scientists have written. Chachmei HaTeva, the scientist of his day, he's reading scientific literature. And I guarantee you it isn't in Yiddish. Sheb'makom sheyam zeh mitached im yam okinus, shehu b'meitzar Gibraltar, shesham kifei baravria, shekemedome shehein nikraim hayom b'shem amudei urgulos. He said something amazing happens, right? Where the Mediterranean Sea meets the Atlantic at a place called Gibraltar, in an area that they refer to as the Pillars of Hercules. Nekar charifusa demaya she'amayim holichim yokinus l'toch yam zeh meshach kama milim. He refers to the particular salinity of the water at this juncture of the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. The rabbi of Old Bichov, not bad. Right? If you flip the page, I've simply given you, none other than Wikipedia, what better source do we have? Right? The Pillars of Hercules. Well known, indeed, right there at the Straits of Gibraltar. And indeed, the rabbi of Old Bichov Radal was right. There is a particularly interesting salinity of the water there where these two bodies of water mix. How did he know that? Certainly that wasn't in the Talmud. It wasn't even in Rossi. I can assure you of that. Let's keep going. On the next page, you have not the Maggid of Slanim, but the Maggid of Navardik, another Lithuanian town, same time period. I'm sorry, this text is a little bit difficult to read, but it's in a work called Kinaf Renani. And if you look at the part that's in the box on the bottom left, let's start at the end of the first line, the word ve'ein. Here's what the Maggid of Navardik writes. Ve'ein laharich, ve'harotze la'amod al amok ha'inyan, ve'ayin b'sefer igrot ha'filosofim la'chacham ha'shalem moreinu harav Moshe ben Maimon. If you want to learn more about this particular issue, says the Maggid of Navardik, in the traditional Lithuanian town in the early 19th century, you want to know more about this, read the letters of the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn. Now these letters, by the way, are written in German. So the only way you could read them is if you read German. And this is a whole different story than what the Netziv had said to read his Chumash commentary, which was at least written in Hebrew. Here's the Maggid of Navardik telling his readers, go read Mendelssohn's German works, his works on philosophy. Let's keep going. The next text that you have in front of you comes from a man by the name of Yoel Dober HaKohen Mivolozhin, somebody else who lived in the little town of Volozhin at the same time as the Netziv. And what you have in front of you are two of the title pages from two of his works, two commentaries that he wrote on the Midrashic work Yalkut Shimoni, works that were traditional works, and for which his commentaries received approbations from the greatest rabbis of his time. What you don't see in front of you are the other works that he wrote, sitting in Volozhin in the 19th century, where he translated the work Adventures of Telemachus, which was a French work, a French political work, no less, which he translated into Hebrew, as well as the Fables of Aesop, and a biography of Aesop, which he wrote as well. Right? They're sitting in Volozhin, in this little hamlet of Lithuania. And the last text which I call your attention to, the next one, comes from Yitzchak Eliyahu Landau, who is none other than the Maggid of Vilna, right? The largest city in Lithuania of its time. And rather than read through the text with you, know that in the famous passage in the Haggadah, where we write that even if we were all sages, Even if we were all wise men, we still would have to tell over the story of the Exodus from Egypt. Yitzchak Eliyahu Landau understands that as a reference to the fact to even if we were all scientists, even if we all understood the biological world, the physical world, the world of astronomy, even if we were all masters of that world, we would still have to tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. So what happened? What happened? If indeed in the early 19th century, rabbinic leaders all over Lithuania were citing all sorts of works, reading all sorts of works that were outside the traditional canon, well, what happened? Why did the Netziv cite them only in his earlier work, which he never published, and not cite them at all in his later work, his Torah commentary? Well, the times changed. The times changed. I referred earlier to something called a maskil, the haskalah, enlightenment. Okay? This process of enlightenment in which Jews began to immerse themselves in the Western world only comes to Eastern Europe, to the world of Lithuania, by the mid-19th century. That is the first time it appears as a serious threat to the traditional world. And my contention is that earlier on in the century, when works were published, people read them. And if you liked what they said, if they worked with what you thought, you cited them. And you told others to read them, because it didn't mean anything. It had no stigma attached to it. Nobody would label you as anything other than a traditional learned Jew. But by the time the middle of the century came, we work our way into the second half of the 19th century, it means something different to be reading the works of Azariah to Rossi. It means something different to be caught with the text of Moses Mendelssohn. Because there were people who were advocating the reading of such texts who were now drifting away from Judaism, who were leaving the traditional world behind. And so the two become equated with one another. And thus the Netziv, who now becomes the Rosh Yeshiva, who is responsible for all of his students, is no longer going to tell them, oh, go read de Rossi, you'll find the answer there. Or, go read Mendelssohn, you'll find the answer there. Because it meant something very different in his time. Let me show you but one final example of this particular shift. What you have before you in the last page of this packet is a text we have seen already. It comes from the work Kinaf Renanim. I call your attention back to this page. Chanukh Zundel. The text of Chanukh Zundel, Ben Yeshaya Luria, the Maggid of Navardik. We saw this text. The text of Kinaf Renanim. And I ask you to go back to this particular version of it for a moment. This is the first printing of Kinaf Renanim, printed earlier on in the 19th century. And let's go back to the words that were there in the box. Again, we start with the last word in the line. He writes, Ve'ein leha'arich. And then he goes on to say, V'harotze la'amod al omek, al amok ha'inyan, ve'ayin b'sefer igros ha'filosofim la'chachama shalei moreinu arav Moshe ben Maimon. Ve'ein laharich, and let's not go on, or here's not the place to go on. Somebody who wants to know more should read the German philosophical letters of Moshe ben Maimon, of Moses Mendelssohn. Belashon Ashkenaz, that's the next line. B'michtav harishon v'hasheni. That's the line underneath the box. After the word v'hasheni is the word v'lazeh. V'lazeh hata'am kasavti, and he goes on. Now move back to the last page. Same text, but a later printing. Later on in the 19th century. The words, Ve'ein laharich, and this is not the place to elaborate. The next words, V'lazeh hata'am. What's missing? The reference to Moses Mendelssohn has been deleted from the text. Because it means something very different to cite Moses Mendelssohn in the late 19th century than it did in the earlier 19th century. So, where does that bring us? It brings us at least to a better understanding of what Rosh Yeshiva, what heads of religious communities in the early 19th century were indeed reading. It gives us a better sense for how the times changed and the way in which the traditional establishment changed along with it and reacted to it. What does it mean for today? That I leave to you. I'll note only, though, in closing, that it seems that some have indeed tried to balance once again both worlds. The world of the yeshiva on the one hand, the world of secular literature and broader learning on the other. And from what I've heard, Ariel Avrech was just that type of person, and therefore I leave you with the words, Zichrono livracha, may his memory be a blessing to us all. Thank you. Sure. Questions? Yes.
Your coverage was extraordinary of what they were reading. Can I ask you where they read it?
Where they read it? Absolutely, in the base measures.
Where did they have access to this literature?
Oh, where they had access to it? Yes, very good.
The Netziv didn't have a shas.
Yes, he did.
Not a whole shas, because he misquotes many Gemaras because of it.
He had a whole shas, for sure. For sure he did. The other thing that I have, he may cite something wrong, that means he didn't look him up, right? But he had access to a whole shas. Another thing that I have documented alongside this particular research is that it coincides directly with the boom in Hebrew printing in Eastern Europe. Right? So that right by the end of the 18th century, right at the turn of the 19th century, there are far many more books available, right, than there ever were in Eastern Europe. And in particular, what happens is that once new printing houses open, we created a glut in the market for your traditional texts. Right? They didn't need any more Talmuds being printed. They didn't need any more Chumashim being printed. They didn't need any more Tseno Re'enos being printed. Right? There were enough of those. And so as new printing houses begin to open, they begin to look for new manuscripts, new texts that hadn't been printed for years. Right? And I can document that these texts have just been reprinted for the first time. And indeed, what we see is that these intellectuals, right, are interested as intellectuals are today. When a new book gets printed, you want to read it. And that's in fact what happens. So many of these texts that are being cited by them are texts that are being reprinted for the very first time in centuries, sometimes for the first time ever, but often for the first time in centuries. And it seems that these people, specifically the intellectual leadership, gobble it up. And it comes off the printing press, and they either sign up, they subscribe for one even before it's printed, which is often how printing worked then, or else they make sure to get a copy as soon as it comes off the press.
Was the Netziv aware that these works were put into favor? Was that clear and clearly known?
Good question. Again, the question is, did the Netziv know, right, that these texts were put into cherem? I can't say for sure. I can say that the Netziv does cite the Maharal elsewhere. He's not a big fan. He doesn't cite him often, right? But he does cite him elsewhere, right? So that, can we assume that, would it be safe to assume that the Netziv has read at least most of the works of the Maharal? It certainly is. Is it possible that he never or skipped over those pages in which he excoriates the Rossi? It certainly is possible. You couldn't say the same about Mendelssohn. Right? There's no way, right, that he doesn't know who Mendelssohn is and how some reacted to Mendelssohn in that world. But the Rossi, it certainly is possible.
I'm just curious about, you commented about, one of the commenters stated that how could you interpret certain methodology in the Talmud as not true. And yet I have to, like for instance, when yesterday, one of the Huvin or Dr. Sadi clearly states examples of things that use the term Havaya, exaggerations, that the question of feeding the goat before, was it a gold cup, and it's got a really gold cup so that the skin would come off the sacrifice. So it goes on and on. It clearly states that many things were exaggerations. So how do they use it?
Well, the answer to that is that what these, like the Maharal and others, would respond is that only places that are clearly identified by the Talmud itself as exaggerations, and in fact they'll use it as proof. In other words, yes, the Talmud recognized that there were certain times that they exaggerated, and they labeled them as such. How dare you assume that something which they did not refer to as exaggeration is in fact exaggeration? Yes, Muskin.
The censorship of Kaufman, the second edition, is that self-censorship?
No, he had passed away by the time that was printed.
Between the example of Kaufman, somebody else is censored, where Netzif has self-censored.
Yes, in Ha'amek Davar, he self-censored. We could call it self-censorship, right? It's a little hard to say that because it never was actually written. It's not as if he actually took it out. And the question of whether he intentionally did not publish his work on the Sifrei is a little murky, right? He certainly intended to. He writes that he intends to earlier on in his life. Why he never got to it, again, we can conjecture that perhaps it's because of what was contained within it, but it's hard to know. But you are absolutely right. Yes, it is definitely different for somebody else, for another generation, or a set of printers and editors to take something out than for somebody to take it out themselves.
And your whole conjecture that by mid-19th century, things are changing. Already, early 19th century, Natan Slifkin now, okay, it's not Lithuania, is denouncing Moshe Mendelssohn.
Without a doubt.
His whole last will and testament is to his family and community, don't you dare look at Moshe Midessa.
At Rabbi Moshe Midessa.
Rabbi Moshe Midessa. That's why I don't think it's a problem. Midessa, that's the way he was known, Moshe Midessa. Right. So I don't even know if that would have been a problem in the first citation. I think that was natural for him to call him that. Everybody.
But remember, he writes Bess out there. It's a bet.
Okay.
That was the issue. Right.
But everybody knew that was Moshe Mendelssohn.
If he had written Dessau, without a doubt, we would all know that. But there is indeed quite a bit of difference between Hungary, Pressburg, and Lithuania and Volozhin during the early 19th century. And in fact, even in Pressburg itself, there was no reform movement there. Right? There were no people of that ilk there. It happens to be the Chassam Sofer himself, Rabbi Moshe Sofer. He's a German. He comes from Germany. He speaks German. Right? He knows that world better than most. Right? And that is a big part of why he feels such a connection and feels so strongly that he has to come out and be the vocal opponent of the reform movement. But it's not as if there was any strong inklings toward reform, even in Pressburg, and certainly not in the world of Vilna or Volozhin in the early 19th century. So they were indeed quite different.
Isn't that true of the entire relationship to the Haskalah movement?
Sorry?
Isn't that true of the entire relationship to the Haskalah movement?
Is what true?
That there was more of a liberal attitude towards Haskalah in Lithuania than there was in Hungary or in Germany after Reverse.
Yes, it is true that Haskalah, as it develops in Eastern Europe and Lithuania, is very different than the Haskalah of Germany. There is no reform movement ever in Eastern Europe, in Lithuania, and the Haskalah movement will continue to have more of a traditional bent to it, right, than it ever will in...
But it flourishes inside of Volozhin.
It doesn't flourish inside of Volozhin. There are those who will become active maskilim who had spent time in Volozhin. It isn't enough. Perhaps it flourishes to some degree in Vilna, but certainly not in Volozhin. There was a question. Yeah.
Yeah. Do we know how old Sid was when he wrote these early writings that weren't published till after he died?
Yes. He started them in his late 20s. Right? The texts themselves, though, I had a hunch in reading the printed texts that this was a text which he had come back to time and time again throughout his life and edited them. When I saw the manuscripts, I confirmed that such in fact was the case. You have a core text which he went back and crossed out and re-edited and put in notes. So the core text definitely dates to the early part of the 19th century, his late 20s and his mid-20s up until about 30, but he clearly continued to add to it. So without actually being able to take that document and separate the later text from the earlier text, it becomes difficult to really know. But none of the citations I looked up, none of the citations of these other works were in the marginalia, were in later additions to the text. They were all in that earlier core text.
How would you compare the current situation now? Because three of the most impressive personalities all have PhDs from universities, which were not yeshivas. I think you know
3 of them.
So the question was, what do I think of the situation?
Rabbi Luther, and of course the Chabad, all of them have PhDs. They didn't go to the yeshiva to get those PhDs.
So the question, what do I think of the situation today? And I will respond with the words of my advisor, who once noted how great it is to be a historian because we talk about people who are dead. and dead people can't talk back. So I will not comment on the current situation other than to bring you texts which you can mull over and form your own opinions as to how that plays out in the current situation. Have the relatives of the Netziv ever read my thesis? The answer is no. We got off to a good start, but things kind of soured thereafter, and I tried to get back in there again, and they wouldn't let me back in. I actually got a call from him just a few months ago, and no, I don't think they have read my thesis yet, and I don't think they want to. Yes?
Just to round out, can you just explain the genealogy? And you said that I was the nephew and brother-in-law, and how it leads up to Ariel University, just a little bit of affiliation.
Okay. Sure, a little bit of a family relationship here. Okay, the Nitziv's first wife was the daughter of Rav Bezalel of Volozhin. Right, that's the woman he married, girl he married. She was 12, he was 14. Okay. And then he went on to become, again, to succeed his father-in-law and become the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin. How old was he when he took, at that point? It was in 1853. He was born in 1816, so it's about. So the Nitziv's, in that first relationship, his first marriage, right, the Torah Tamima was the nephew of the Nitziv. Right? His mother was also, let me get this right, was the sister of the Nitziv. Okay? The Torah Tamima's mother was a sister of the Nitziv. Okay, the Aruch HaShulchan's wife was a sister of the Nitziv. Okay? So that he was originally his nephew. Okay? Later on in life, his first wife, the Nitziv's first wife, dies. And he remarries the sister of the Torah Tamima. Okay? The sister of the Torah Tamima, I'm sorry, it was not his mother. Right? He was his nephew, but it was not his mother. So he remarries the sister of the Torah Tamima, right, which then makes makes the Nitziv both his uncle and his brother-in-law.
And that's the relationship that gets bigger or
Okay, very good. The first relationship, from the first marriage, came the Nitziv's first son, Chaim Berlin, after whom the yeshiva is named. And from the second marriage, much later on in life, comes his next son, Meir Bar Ilan, after whom the university is named. Two different people going in two very different directions, which explains a lot about the Nitziv and who the Nitziv himself was.
Please rise for the Gil
Es nishmas Ariel Chaim
Ruven Yaakov, Shalach Le'olamo, Bavu Shemishpato, Yitnu Tzedaka, Bi'ad Askaras Nishmaso, V'ganei Yeden Teimenu Chasa, Lochein Balo Rachamim, Yasnirei V'seiser Kenafav Li'olamim, V'yitzror Mitzar Achaim Es Nishmasa, Adonai Unachasa, V'yanuach V'shalom Al Mishkavo Dinomar Amen.
You don't mind to drop your head. You don't miss off the head. I don't want to do the kind of head. It's real. I got lost. Come on. Torah, Elon, Meon, Maya. Torah, Ishtalah, Tifar, Rizom. Okay. That's Shut the coat. Very long cover, touch, touch, you all hold up the gate, up the gate, I'll come my house to your right hand. You don't try to take this all the time and hard. You hear the one who touched on the rock, you know, the rock man. I know if it was never the bed. For kind of cut out how would you smile, I'll be rude. Hey, Slammer, smile. I am later, I'll call you Israel. I said, Shalom, Rupert, I said, Shalom, I'll later, I'll help you.